Great.
We're ready to roll.
Great. So good morning to participants joining us from the West Coast and Mountain Region, and good afternoon to attendees from the rest of the country. My name is Steven Jackson, and it's an honor to be your moderator today for a rich discussion on race, racism, equality, and equity. How far have we come, and where is America today? Today's conversation is brought to you by Building Relationships in Diverse Groups for Equity, aka the Bridge Project, a private team of optimistic problem solvers who wish to do better regarding race relations in America. This session is being recorded, and out of respect for our guests and participants, kindly keep yourselves muted unless speaking. So before we start, I'll briefly hand the floor to Bridge Project team leadership team member, Tanette Brown, who will discuss our code of conduct, setting the tone for what we expect from our esteemed panelists and participants during today's discussion. Tanette, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I hope everyone is having a great afternoon. I just want to set the rules of engagement for the team so that we all can get everything that we need to get out of this discussion. First things first is that we should all come with the mindset of assuming the good, right? Don't assume ill intent. Let's assume everyone is speaking from a good place, right? The second requirement is that we listen actively. So don't listen planning your next thought. Listen to hear what's truly being said and save your question for the end, okay? The next thing is that we would like for everyone to understand that the goal is not to agree. We're not here all to agree, but the goal is to gain an understanding, right? So we're all here to learn something today. And with that in mind, we need your participation in order to do that. The active listening, please ask any questions. Please put them in the chat if you would like for us to review them as a larger group as we move on. And then the most important thing is that we want everyone to just enjoy the discussion, right? So it's no right way, no wrong way. It's about learning. And with that in mind, we ask that you would just kindly stay muted and always be respectful. Enjoy the discussion.
Thanks, Tanette. Very good advice and guidance. Again, welcome. My name again, for those just joining, is Steven Jackson, and I'm a leadership team member of Building Relationships in Diverse Groups for Equity, also known as the Bridge Project. I'm moderating today's 90-minute discussion titled Race, Racism, Equality, and Equity, How Far Have We Come, and Where is America Today? Today's conversation is broken into 4 10 to 12-minute segments featuring 2 history professors lasting approximately 40 to 45 minutes. And I'll ask our panelists a few questions on each topic. The first segment is on the historic relevance of Juneteenth and why it is important today. Second, we'll discuss critical race theory and the 1619 Project. Third, I'll ask our panelists about Confederate symbols and Southern heritage, focused on what role should they play in 2021. And finally, and fourth, we will discuss lessons from US history when communities have been successful in building bridges that bring diverse groups together, diverse in ethnicity, race, and thought. The remaining 45 minutes or so will be open to audience participation in the question and answer format with our esteemed panelists. Simply, as Danette mentioned, type or post your question in the chat, and we will get to them as many as possible. A few guests who prefer to speak or to ask their question verbally, I will just simply raise your hand in Zoom and I will call on you in order. So given the amount of misinformation in social media, our team's goal here is to elevate the level of discussion on these important topics with people who know what they're talking about. So please join me in warmly welcoming with your reaction signs our 2 esteemed panelists, history professors Dr. Stephen Tootle and Dr. eJeffrey Kerr-Ritchie. So it is my honor. I'll put the full bios in the chat, but just let me introduce them very briefly. Our first speaker is Dr. eJeffrey Kerr-Ritchie. He was born in London in the UK. He earned his first history degree in Kensington University and completed his doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania and went on to teach at Wesleyan Columbia, Penn, SUNY Binghamton, and University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He's been teaching the African diaspora field at Howard University since 2006 and has been director of graduate studies since 2015, during which time the program has moved up to 79th in the nation. His research interests include slavery, abolition, and post-emancipation societies, especially in North America and the Caribbean. So welcome, Jeffrey. Our second esteemed panelist is Dr. Stephen Tootle, who is a professor of history at the College of Sequoias in Visalia, California, and honored visiting graduate faculty in history and government at Ashland University in Ashland, Ohio. He is a native of California and earned his BA from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and his master's or MA from California State University, Fresno, and completed his PhD in history at Ohio University in the fields of modern American political history, American intellectual history, modern European intellectual history, and the Soviet Union. He's so we're honored to have both guests today. I just want to quickly acknowledge and give a quick shout out to the Bridge Project co-founders, John Brackney and John Hodge, if you could just raise your hands, and to leadership team members, Mary Kanowitz and John Spoon. So without further ado, let's kick off our first segment on the historic relevance of Juneteenth and why it's important today. Professor Kerr-Ritchie, what is Juneteenth and why is it important today? What do you tell your students?
Well, let me begin by thanking the Bridge Project for an opportunity to engage a public audience on important topics. I could tell you, I could spend an hour and a half talking about what Juneteenth is. I won't. Instead, I would do two things. Firstly, I would recommend those people who are interested to actually go online and sort of check out what's there and, you know, use your nonce to sort of distinguish between what sounds like it's sort of interesting and informative versus what's not. I would distinguish between Juneteenth very briefly as a historical event versus its commemorative tradition. Obviously, June 19th, 1865, a Union General declares that the Civil War is over and slavery has been abolished. It's important to recognize that this announcement comes between Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January the 1st, 1863, which effectively declares emancipation in all non-union held territory. We can talk about that later because it's complicated. And the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, December 1865, which legally abolishes the institution of slavery. So it's important to see that particular moment. The event itself was commemorated by Black Texans for the first time in 1865 in Galveston, and thereon became an unofficial Black Texan holiday of a commemorative event over the decades, and in fact spread as an institution. But then in the 20th century, it sort of lost traction somewhat for a variety of complicated reasons we don't have time to go into, but was resurrected in the 1960s as a consequence of the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. Fast forward to 1980, when a Black Texan legislature finally got the state to recognize Juneteenth as a state holiday. And of course, 40 years later, this June, we have the first federal holiday of slavery and the abolition of slavery. Why is it important today? I think it's important today for two reasons. Firstly, it's an opportunity for people to think seriously about the complicated nature of American history and the central role that slavery and the abolition of slavery played in that history. But I also think it's important for a second reason. It's important for political reasons. Juneteenth, like most commemorative holidays, has been used both as a way to remember the past, but also as a way to think about and mobilize for the present and for the future. I would argue, for example, that this meeting that we're having today would not have began with a discussion on Juneteenth if it had not been for the fact that Juneteenth fell so precipitously after the murder of George Floyd last year. Juneteenth has taken on a sort of a symbolic importance which I have not seen in decades of teaching about slavery and emancipation. So I think that's really, really important, right? In terms of what I tell my students, all sorts of things about about these events. I don't really have time to go into them, but those are some of the things that I would say to them.
Excellent. Professor Tootle, anything to add? Is Juneteenth taught in schools K through 12? If not, why not? If so, how is it being framed?
I would just say that I agree with everything that Jeffrey said. Because I remember I got married on Juneteenth, and as a historian, there were a bunch of historians at my wedding, and they all knew what Juneteenth was, but nobody else did. And that was in 2000 and I should know what year I got married. 2004. I know what year I got divorced. But you're right. In 2004, only the people with PhDs in history knew what Juneteenth was. And so I think Jeffrey is absolutely right in how he described its, in fact, the thing I would always compare it to before it became more widely known was Cinco de Mayo, because that was an event that was popularized by Mexican Americans in Texas that eventually became a more widely recognized holiday to celebrate other things. I'm talking about in the years before it was more widely known, Juneteenth at least. But I think Jeffrey was absolutely spot on with everything he said.
So either of you, is Juneteenth taught in schools K through 12 or not?
I don't know.
I think it depends where you are. So I'm not, I don't keep up with events in sort of K through 12 schools in Texas, although unfortunately, we are being reminded of what's happening in Texas, and maybe we can talk about this later, given the terrible laws that are being passed by that legislature in Austin about sort of the teaching of history, and they are awful, and I look forward to sort of explaining that more later. But I can tell you that our youngsters attend public schools in North Carolina, and both of our boys they only know about Juneteenth through their father. They do not know about Juneteenth through their through the schools. But I would say, Stefan, you've got a question here. In your view, how should it be taught? I don't spend a lot of time teaching Juneteenth at Howard because it's a specific event which has been thrown up by a particular sort of, remarkable sort of a duality, an event, a murder, and the massive outrage in response to that murder, right? But no, I think what's more important is that the issues of the origins of slavery, the nature of slavery, the centrality to the political and economic structure of slavery to the United States, is taught. How that's taught, right? The depth with which it's taught, I think depends largely on the sort of the knowledge, the energy of the pedagogue, the teacher, the school, and the politics of the school districts, right? But generally speaking, no, I would refrain from sort of some specific point, and I would talk more broadly about this event. And the one thing I would always insist upon, and I do insist upon with students at Howard and before I taught at Howard, slavery is not incidental to the American story. And people who say that it is, okay, clearly are showing a remarkable ignorance about the American past. Slavery is absolutely essential. In fact, I would go so far as to say we cannot understand the United States without the institution of slavery. And the United States is not unique here. We cannot understand Caribbean societies without understanding the institution of slavery. Just think of Jamaica. Jamaica was colonized by the Brits in 1662. 300 years later, Jamaica gains its independence from the British. Slavery is abolished in 1834. For 200 odd years, slavery was a critical component of Jamaica's past. In fact, Jamaica spent more time in slavery than it has in freedom. And you could make the same argument for the not for the United States, but for the American colonies plus the United States. So that's the sort of thing that I would really insist upon, right? Which is really grappling with the centrality of the politics and the economics, right, of this institution.
Well, wonderful. Stephen, do you have anything to add?
I'd just say that I agree, and that one of the real problems is that you can't teach something you don't know. And I don't know what it's like in every other state, but in California, you can become a teacher of K through 8 only having taken one history class, and that is world history up to 1500. And so I don't know how we could expect teachers to teach something that they themselves don't know. And it's certainly not the fault of students, and it's not even the fault of the teachers themselves. If we truly wanted to prioritize these things, we should require K-8 teachers to actually have to take some history classes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate both of your reflections, because coming from Denver myself, Juneteenth was celebrated during my adolescence. And it's interesting to see that it hasn't been widely, I guess, celebrated in other parts of the country. So I was curious. I'm really looking forward to this next segment. What we're going to do is we're going to now transition to segment 2 on critical race theory and the 1619 project. So Professor Tootle, I should call you Stephen, I need to get in the habit of that. I've read a lot of articles conflating critical race theory with other initiatives and topics. What is CRT? What is it not? And why is it under attack?
Well, I guess I've been thinking about this with a lot of friends. How do you have a more productive discussion about this? Because if there tends to be, as you said, a lot of people who conflate these issues, and then the second you say, well, I thought this was just some sort of legal theory or something, you say, oh, well, no, I want it taught in schools. So in and of itself, critical race theory is a legal theory about how to interpret the law. I would say that if the idea that you would want that taught in schools would be strange, because we don't teach any other particular like theoretical frameworks in K-12 education. It's the kind of thing that you would discuss in an intellectual history graduate seminar, along with other theoretical frameworks. Now, I think to make the discussion more productive, I would say maybe we should just pivot to the what we want people to teach about history and how we want history education to happen, because on one hand, the reaction to extremism has been kind of an even sillier extremism, and I've certainly gotten the impression that people are talking past one another when they discuss these issues rather than digging in and saying what they really want. And projects like this are nice because you can get past the label and maybe talk about what is it that you actually want here. Because frankly, when I see the legislative attempts to try to regulate the teaching of critical race theory, they seem to all be as clumsy and strange as the attempt to teach it. So I guess I skipped over maybe what people think it is versus what it actually is. It's a theoretical framework that says that there is a hierarchy of oppressions, and that you need to reevaluate history on the basis of power relationships. And we can maybe go into more depth, but I'm interested in what Jeffrey has to say on this question, if he thinks I butchered that or if he would disagree.
So, go ahead.
Thank you, Stephen. I have to disagree, otherwise we're all going to fall fast asleep, aren't we?
Yeah.
So I would respond this way to the question and also what Stephen's just said. First of all, the argument for not teaching critical race theory in public schools is because it's a conceptual framework. That's not persuasive. After all, what's the difference between teaching US history, right, devoid of slavery and sort of, all of these things we're aware of, to CRT. So I don't think that's persuasive. I do think, however, your point about its conceptual difficulty is important, right? I think you've got to think about that. You've got to be real here, teaching K through 12 students. So that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make in terms of CRT is when CRT first showed its head a couple of decades ago, I remember shaking my head thinking, my goodness, these people have never read any Marx. They've never read any Gramsci. Marx pointed out in the 1840s that, law is an instrument of the state. And a lot of Marxists have made the argument since that law is a tool of property ownership, right? In the 20th century, that's become more sophisticated. And in the context of the United States, with the sort of centrality of race in the United States, there's no coincidence that the two would come together. So what I like about, I don't teach CRT. What I like about it is if it gets us to think critically about the nature of law as a tool of property. I think that's really important, precisely because the way in which law is so often represented and taught in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and a lot of other Western democracies is somehow above the sort of, the stress and toil of life. It's not. It's made by men and it's interpreted by men. And in terms of the Supreme Court, US Supreme Court now, women we can add, right? In a particular way, right? So I think it's good that way. Where I think it's problematic is it ignores, I don't like the rough way in which it just destroys the tremendous amount of struggle waged by, let's say, people, Americans of African descent and others, to change the law away from what it is to what it could be. That is a real problem. What does critical race theory do with the largest one of the largest non-protest movements in the 20th century, obviously the CRM, the Civil Rights Movement? Mahatma Gandhi, of course, himself, 20, 30 years beforehand, is really pushing a non-violence against British colonialism. In India, we're familiar with that. It is to change the law of British colonial control of India, right? King et al. Are really trying to change this law, and we get these two very important sort of pieces of legislation in 1964 and 1965, which most people are familiar with. I don't think critical race theory is subtle enough to sort of deal with the importance of those types of struggles to actually change the law, right? So those would be my responses.
Yeah, and let me just, I need to agree with you even more because you hit upon two things. Yeah, sorry, this is not turning out to be a great debate. But you hit on two other things that just reminded me of things that really offended me when I would hear these debates. And one is that it robs people of the autonomy that I always found so precious. I mean, to me, one of the greatest contributions of and I would say underutilized intellectuals in American history was what freed slaves brought to discussions about the centrality of individual autonomy. And with what Jeffrey just said, you're robbing these people of describing their own lives. You're saying that I have this conceptual framework that's more important than your story about what you're saying is important. And you're taking away their individual action in, like you said, changing their situation and the effect that they can have on society and politics and culture. And then, but that's also true. I mean, just get to defend my problem with conceptual frameworks. As we were talking, I was reminded of something that happened to me about a different conceptual framework. I did my outside field in American literature, and I was doing a project on James Weldon Johnson in this class, and who's a accomplished author, did many wonderful things, so hard to pigeonhole exactly what he is, other than an amazing man. But I remember going around the table, and at least in literature classes, I felt very out of place, because what they had all been taught in literature classes is adopt an intellectual framework and then apply it to everything, and then you'll get your PhD in literature, you know. So you would go around the table and it would be like, oh, I'm this kind of Marxist, and I'm going to take this form and apply it to everything I read, and that will be every paper I write. And then the next person, it would be, you know, name your theory, right? And then when they got to me, and this gets to another thing I think we share in common as historians. I mean, I won't speak for you, but it's antithetical to what we do as historians, which is we're supposed to gather up this evidence and then try to tell a true story. And that's what I try to tell my students, that one of the things we have to fight against is our own confirmation bias. And if you begin with a theoretical framework, you're giving yourself a confirmation bias that you will then carry into all of your work. Now let me defend conceptual frameworks. Let me take because it does serve one important or many important, it can do something else though, which is the reason it's important for, I think, intellectuals to learn about these conceptual frameworks is because you can use them to apply to American history in order to check your own biases. So, you know, it is, or it will bring certain events into relief that maybe you hadn't thought about very much. And you'll say, well, I never would have noticed that if I hadn't applied a sort of feminist framework to this study or something like that. But, you know, for those two reasons, in that, you know, I got into history because of a sense of love and obligation. And I love James Weldon Johnson. I want to do right by him in a like cosmic sense. I feel a sense of love and obligation to him. I want to get his story right before I do anything else. And I think that too often we focus on people who want to think outside the box without learning the box first. Like first learn what James Weldon Johnson said, then start applying frameworks to him. You know, first learn American history and then start applying theoretical frameworks to it. but at least how I have always approached history, the idea of applying a theoretical framework before you learn the content is kind of putting the cart before the horse.
Well, thank you both for your reflections. I'm sitting there thinking, wow, they're both agreeing, but clearly there's a lot of disagreement in our society overall. So maybe we can get to that a little bit later and your thoughts about that. But to wrap up this segment, I just really want to quickly get to the 1619 project. What are accurate and reliable sources of information for Bridge Project members should note to better understand the 1619 project? Do you have any comments about the project and your thoughts about if it's useful or pros and cons?
Sure. Whenever people are arguing about the past, I'm happy. And in many ways, that should have been my opening comment, because all four of these segments that you have here are all about discussions and debates. I don't have an issue with Americans arguing about 1619 or the heritage or sort of how to remember slavery, etc. I think it's great that they actually are, because we live in such an ahistorical society. We live in a society whose central component is modernity, which is looking forward, absolutely critical. I say that as a card-carrying member of a society which is always looking backwards, and the second largest form of revenue, i.e. tourism, okay, is based upon, right, people enjoying a country looking backwards with all the wonderful Elysian fields and country houses, blah, blah. America is modern. And so the issue here is, right, people don't have time for the past. And that's supposed to be a clever comment, right? They don't have time for the past. And I think that's part of the problem. Not having time for the past opens up all sorts of difficulties trying to make sense of the present, right? And I think so many of these questions that we've got here are sort of really relating to that. Getting to the central point here, Steven, the 1619 project is based upon the arrival in Jamestown of a Dutch slave trading ship carrying 16, quote, Negroes, end of quote. And it's seen as one of the formative moments in African-American history. And so a group of journalists basically put together a New York Times special in the summer of 1619 and wrote about various aspects of the Black American experience over 4 centuries. I think its importance was pointing to the, or really using a tool, like a powerful medium like the New York Times, to get people to read and to think about sort of this tremendously complicated, painful, but important history of Black America, which was also American, right? That was the good stuff. The bad stuff is that looking carefully at the contributors, you could hardly recognize any historians. They were overwhelmingly journalists, and that is a problem. And it's a problem because so many historians have contributed so much ink over the decades to, reshape, reform, complicate America's